Hi, in this video I'm going to explain to you how to learn absolutely anything, but you've come here to learn biology, so you might ask, why do I want to learn absolutely anything? And the answer is because you learn everything the same way. So whether it's biology or Greek or Spanish or maths, it doesn't really matter. There's a series of techniques that have been shown to make it much more likely that you're going to be able to learn the stuff that you need to in a reasonable amount of time. Give you some idea of how important this is. This graph that's in the background here is showing the percentage of people that got various grades in A-level biology when they started with the GCSE average score of between 6.9 and 7.3. So if we call it 7.1, that's the sort of middle of that range. So 7 is a pretty good grade, and an average of 7 is probably not a particularly large portion of the population. And most sixth forms will let you in to study biology with an average of 5s. In fact, some of them will let you with a 4. So if we start with a student that's getting 7s at GCSE, you can see that actually a small percentage of the people that come to study A-level with that GCSE profile actually fail outright. Not many, a few percent. A small percent, perhaps 2%, get E's. And then coming up to about 20% is E's and D's. And then between about 20% and just short of what, probably that's 40%, 45% is C's. And then again, between about sort of 45% to about 75%. So that's 30% of people are going to get a B. And then about 20% of people are going to get an A. And then about 5% of people are going to get an A star. So the obvious question is, if everybody's coming from the same starting place, how come there's such a broad range of possible outcomes from everybody that started with the same GCSE scores? And the answer is really that what separates these students is partly, it's the school that they go to. That definitely makes a difference. Partly it's whatever's happening in their lives that makes a difference. But most of it has been shown to be whether they understand tractor, gone, whether they understand really how to go about learning the enormous amount of material that they have to learn for A-level biology. So the biggest discriminator, the most likely thing to make the difference between you walking out with an E and you walking out with an A, is whether you do a good job of learning all the stuff. Now that seems really obvious, but what is less obvious is how do I actually do that then? How do I learn all this material? The good news is that an awful lot of time, money, and brains has gone into working out how to do this. And the answer is this. So when you learn something, you take some noise, some information from the environment, and you put it into your short-term memory. It stays in your short-term memory for a matter of seconds. If you don't get it into your long-term memory, you're going to forget it. Once it's into your long-term memory, if you don't do something with it, you're going to forget it. And really, the secret of learning things is to make sure that you're doing the right arrows. You're going from the environment to the short-term memory, from the short-term memory to the long-term memory, and then staying in the long-term memory. Once again, there's good news here because we know how to move things from the environment to the short-term memory, how to move them from the short-term memory to the long-term memory, and how to keep them in the long-term memory. And the answer is pay attention, make it meaningful, and do recall regularly and in a difficult way. So if we start with the pay attention part, the first thing that you have to accept is that you have one attention. You can pay attention properly to one thing at once. If your phone is beeping at you and you're paying attention to your phone, you're not paying attention to the thing that you're learning. It sounds like I'm having a waggedy finger, but unfortunately it's just true. And multitasking is a myth. You cannot do 4 things at once. You can't listen to music, revise biology, talk to your friends, and carry on a text conversation at the same time. In fact, our attention is so limited, we can pay attention to one thing at once, that we even need to be careful about what sort of music we listen to when we study. There's plenty of evidence that music with voices distracts our attention. We're social monkeys. We're used to listening for cues from other social monkeys. If we hear somebody talking, we pay attention to it. If we hear someone singing, we pay attention to the lyrics. The good news is that entirely instrumental music has the opposite effect. It actually helps us to focus our attention. So if you are going to listen to music when you study, don't listen to something with words. Listen to something without. Of course, we've already mentioned it, but the biggest menace to your attention is your phone. I'm the same. Everybody is. Our phones are in our hands all the time. There is, of course, an easy way out of this. Turn your phone to airplane mode. I say it's easy. It's not easy, is it? It's not easy to disconnect from the social world. But if you don't, it'll blip at you. If it blips at you, you're not paying attention to what you're doing. You won't learn anything like as much as you will if all of your attention is on the thing that you're supposed to be doing. Clearly, turning your phone to airplane mode is only part of the story. There's a sort of tidal wave of materials that want our attention. Our phone wants our attention, our computer wants our attention, our email wants our attention, the whole world wants our attention. So while it is true that we can do something about controlling the number of distractions in our lives, don't be too harsh on yourself. The world is made as a noisy place to get your attention, and you'll find that whatever you do, every now and again, it just doesn't work. Don't be too hard on yourself. Just get back to your study away from whatever it is that's distracted you. One easy win is to make sure that the place that you study contains as few distractions as possible. So a desk that isn't piled high, unlike my bookcases, with a ton of other stuff to attract your attention, is a much better place to work than in a environmentally noisy place, a place where there's lots of cues, lots of things for you to pay attention to outside of what you're trying to pay attention to. Okay, so much for paying attention. So then the second thing we need to do is get this material from our short-term memory to our long-term memory. And the answer there is to make it meaningful in some way to yourself. And it doesn't need to be meaningful to anybody else. It just needs to be meaningful to you. So at this point, I'd make an appeal for you not to throw out all of the stuff that you've used at your GCSE biology or whatever science it is that you studied at GCSE. So if you've got some old flashcards, if you've got some more of the fabulous CGP revision guides, if you've got some books that you've used that you filled with post-its and highlighter pens, don't throw them away. They're a really useful cue for you to be able to fit the things that you're about to learn to the things that you already know. So the secret here is to identify common themes and principles, and a well-written textbook or a well-written website or a well-made video will give you an overview of what you're going to do before it starts getting into the detail. Once you recognize the sort of principles or the basic idea, you can start fitting what you already know into this, or rather start fitting this new material into whatever you know. And here's an example. So the sort of graphic in the middle of this picture is taken from the fabulous BBC bite-sized GCSE revision course, and it's the sort of central organizing graphic, the thing that sort of gives a summary of everything that you need to know about the nervous system and about nerves. And all I've done is I've basically said, okay, well that's what I know already. That's the GCSE knowledge. What do I need to add into that? So I've looked through the A-level textbook, and basically I've said, okay, then, so I already know from GCSE that there are receptors. I'm going to learn some specific receptors and how they work and how they transduce signals and how they hand that signal on to the rest of the nervous system. I'm going to learn about the Pacinian corpuscles in the skin. I'm going to learn about osmoregulators in the hypothalamus, etc. And then I've done the same for all the other sort of subtopics, if you like, in the A-level syllabus. I fitted the A-level syllabus into my GCSE knowledge, so I've got somewhere to hang it, so I can connect it together to something that I already know. Okay, so a word or two, a little bit of advice about how it is that you go about sort of writing all this stuff down, if you like. And I think the first thing you need to try and get into your head is that the initial part of writing stuff down and seeing it how it fits together, it's a thinking tool. It's a work in progress. It's not a final set of beautiful notes. You don't need a final set of beautiful notes. There are textbooks, there are websites that have done all that for you already. The purpose of sort of writing down what you already know and trying to work out how the new ideas fit into it is to allow you to explore your understanding. So it's a provisional thing, it's a temporary thing. You're probably going to throw it away in a sort of half an hour's time once you've had a good old think about stuff. So I'd encourage you to use something like a whiteboard or like a roll of backing paper, like the old-fashioned stuff they used to put underneath wallpaper. It's dirt cheap. You can get like 200 meters of it for like £5. Or a flip chart page or something that you know just isn't really for keeping. And then when you've got this thing in front of you, you're asking yourself questions like, what do I know about this topic already? What else is like this? How does this new information that I'm learning fit into what I already know? And I'd encourage you to like use a pencil, which again, you know, in your mind, a pencil is something you rub out. That's brilliant because it's like a thinking exercise. It's not a permanent record of your notes. You know, like I said before, you don't need notes. You've got textbooks and websites full of notes. You need thinking. So use a pencil, draw stuff, Make it as messy or as tidy as it works for you, it doesn't matter. But remember, it's not a permanent thing. It doesn't need looking at repeatedly. You're just trying to get your brain into the place where you can think, right, how does this stuff fit together? Okay, so you've explored the new material in terms of the stuff that you already know. You've fitted stuff together and given it somewhere to live in your long-term memory, so it's much more likely to stay where it is. Now what you need to do is to get it out, look at it, and stick it back in again. You need to do recall practice. Now there's tons of stuff on the internet about recall practice, so I'm not going to go completely bonkers on this. I'm just going to show you some things that I know work. So here are three basic principles of how to make recall practice or retrieval practice, call it what you want to, work for you. So the first one is effortful retrieval leads to better retention. If it's hard to do, you're more likely to remember it. So looking at the textbook and reading back over the textbook again, that's not recalling, that's recognizing, and that's not strenuous on your head. That's just reading back over stuff that you already know. So is rereading your notes. So is rewriting your notes. If all you're doing is like copying the material either from the page to your head or from page to page, it's not difficult and it's not going to really stress your memory, and it's not going to reinforce the pathways in your brain that you're trying to reinforce so that you remember things into the long term. The second principle is that repeated testing improves retention. So you should be expecting to revisit things 4, 5, 6 times before they're really completely happy inside your head. And I'll show you a graph that explains why this works, which you've probably seen before in a little bit. And then the third general principle is corrective feedback is crucial. So when you have had a go at trying to remember everything, check it. Get someone else to check it would be ideal, but check it yourself at the very least. Compare what you think you know to what's in the textbook, what's on the website, what's some authoritative set of notes or information, and correct any mistakes that you've made. So here's an example of the sort of thing that I mean. So the sort of central image on this page is a couple of pages from one of the big A-level textbooks. There's a reference to which textbook it is in the bottom right-hand side. And if I wanted to sort of test if I understood this, what I'd do is I'd open the page, I'd write down the main headings, notice that it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-step process, and I'd notice that there is some crucially important diagram which I've highlighted in pink in the left-hand side. And then I close the textbook. I'm not going to read the material. All I'm asking myself is, what do I need to try to remember here? And the answer is I need to try to remember what an action potential is, and I need to remember that it's got 6 steps. And then I'd just have a go at writing out each of the 6 steps. Step 1 is whatever I think it is. Step 2 is whatever I think it is. The diagram is whatever I think the diagram is. And then I'd stop, go back to the textbook, check what's in the textbook versus what I've written, and then I'd use dual coding, 2 different colors. One color for stuff that I've missed out completely, I just forgot it was there, and another color for stuff that I've got wrong. And then I'd have another go at exactly the same idea a couple of days later. And what you'll discover is that after 2 or 3 tries, it's in your head and it never leaves. Okay, so this is quite a famous graph. This is called you can just put my glasses on, I'm going to take them off now. This is called the forgetting graph, and it basically shows how much you remember after a certain amount of time. So if you look at the red line, the first time you learn something, by a day later, you've forgotten about half of it. So if you look at where the orange arrow is, after 1 day, I've got about 50% of material I can still remember. So days on the x-axis, how much you remember on the y-axis. If I relearn it on day 2, a day later, I remember not 50% of it, but about 75% of it. If I revisit it on day 3, a day later, I remember not 75% of it, but 80% of it. If I look at it again another day, if I do more recall practice, more blurting, more whatever technique I choose to use, another time, I remember 95% of it. And you can see that the lines, the red line and then the successive green lines, they get gradually shallower and shallower and shallower. And what that's telling me is that if I revisit stuff, it becomes increasingly unlikely that I'm going to forget it. Now, you'll also notice that you need multiple goes at this sort of stuff to be able to remember it. So when I said it takes 3, 4, 5 times of revisiting all the material to be sure that it's going to stay in your head, unfortunately that's true. But the good news is that's true. So one of the things that you really need to try to get your head around in A-level biology as quickly as you possibly can is that revision is just a constant thing. You're forever just picking something up and having another go at it, and picking something up and having another going at it. And then what you're doing is taking advantage of this fact that repeated recall practice makes it almost impossible to forget things. So here's a bizarre thing. When I was a kid, I had a bet with a friend that I couldn't remember. I was a strange kid, that I couldn't remember these square roots. I know it's lunatic. The square roots of the first 10 prime numbers. And I can still remember most of them. And it's just because, I was a kid, it was a bet, I had to win. And I just practiced. And 2.645751311 is still the square root of 7. And 2.828427125 is still the square root of 8. Okay? So, I mean, that's a ridiculous example, but it just shows the power of recall practice. If you return to things and you practice them a few times, it becomes almost impossible to forget them. So the good news is that by revisiting material, it gets to the stage where you just can't forget it. The really good news is that there is an automated way of reminding you to look at stuff that you're forgetting. And there's all sorts of apps available for doing this now, but my favorite is Anki app. And I've got a little graphic from the Anki app website on the right-hand side. There are a few versions of Anki app. I think the one that's easiest to use is the one with the orange arrows on it, like the image on the right-hand side here. Anki app, basically, you put flashcards into it. You're better off making your own flashcards than using other people's. You put flashcards into it, and that process is really simple and straightforward. And I've got another video explaining in detail how to use it. You put flashcards into Anki app and it tests you. If you get it 100% right, it tests you again, but in about 2 months. If you get it sort of right, it asks you again in a couple of days. If you get it completely wrong, it asks you tomorrow. So the idea is it keeps track of what you're forgetting and it reminds you of the stuff that you're forgetting. The stuff that you're not forgetting, it doesn't bother you about. You don't need to spend time going over the stuff you already know. You need to spend time going over the stuff you don't know. And Anki app is a really easy way of keeping track of that sort of stuff. Okay, here it is, the inevitable plug. So clearly I do these videos because it's my business. I'm a tutor. I teach A-level biology. I've got other videos explaining in detail how to use blurting, that method of writing down the headlines from the textbook and then trying to remember everything that you can and then checking your understanding. I've also got other videos going into detail of how to use Anki app, how to make flashcards on it, what makes a good flashcard, etc. So if you've enjoyed this video, there's links at the end to all the rest in this sort of series really of how to learn absolutely anything. So the last thing that I'm going to say is it's good news. You can learn absolutely anything. The less good news, if you like, or the important news, is that you need to get started soon. Okay, you need to make sure that you've given enough time because these processes, they're not quick. You need to revisit things. You need to revisit them multiple times. It needs to be hard for you to be able to remember it. You can't just read through the textbook. That ain't going to do anybody any good whatsoever. Anyway, enough. Bye.